Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're going to be diving into a deeply provocative, highly specific philosophical critique of modern reproductive history. We're looking at a text titled Heaven Made Hell, and we'll be objectively unpacking the author's fairly controversial arguments regarding human autonomy and what they see as the true legacy of the birth control movement. It's a heavy one, so let's get right into it. Now, to really grasp this critique, we first need to understand the author's foundational lens. The text basically divides human ideas into two very strict camps, philosophy and ideology. So philosophy is defined here as the process of reforming our subjective desires to match an objective truth, right? Ideology, on the other hand, is the exact opposite. It's reforming truth to match our subjective desires. And the core argument being made here is that modern society has completely abandoned philosophy in favor of ideology. Building right on top of that, the text categorizes our cultural mistakes into two distinct types. First, you have what they call masculine error. Think overt, forceful destruction, kind of like a hammer. And then there is feminine error, which is described as a covert, subtle rewiring of relationships. The author argues that our modern reproductive norms, well, they weren't forcefully imposed on us. Instead, they were subtly rewired into our culture, often disguised as compassion. So here is our roadmap for The Explainer today. We're going to dissect this argument step by step. We'll start with the ideological drift, trace Margaret Sanger's genealogy, examine the Puerto Rico trials, quantify the statistical shipwreck, and then finally look at the demographic collapse. All right, let's jump right into part one, the ideological drift, the abandonment of anchors. The core argument starts with this idea of a fundamental drift in our moral anchors. Historically, a Judeo-Christian worldview valued the inherent sanctity of all human life. But this text argues that society drifted away from that, basically moving toward a new idol, absolute individual autonomy. By prioritizing personal desire and the self above absolutely everything else, the author claims the foundation was laid for radical social reform. It essentially stripped away the belief that human life has inherent objective value. Moving right along to part two, Margaret Sanger's genealogy, tracing the roots. You see, this ideological shift didn't just happen in a vacuum. The text traces it directly back to Margaret Sanger. When you track the historical progression, the rapid evolution is actually kind of wild. In just a few decades, she went from publishing a highly controversial newsletter called The Woman Rebel in 1914, which literally had the motto, "No gods, no masters," to opening the first illegal birth control clinic in the U.S. in 1916. By 1921, she founded the American Birth Control League, which, as you might know, later became Planned Parenthood. And then in 1930, she initiated the Negro Project. For the author, this progression shows exactly how she championed individual autonomy to totally shape the modern sexual landscape. To challenge the more favorable modern narratives we hear about Sanger, the text pulls up some pretty stark archival records. Take this 1939 letter regarding the Negro Project, where Sanger wrote to Dr. Clarence Gamble. She said, "We do not want word to go out that we want to exterminate the Negro population." Now, for the author, this is presented as clear evidence that her true intentions were deeply rooted in eugenics and population control, not simply alleviating poverty in minority communities. And this eugenic throughline is strongly reinforced by her 1922 book, The Pivot of Civilization. Sanger states, and I quote, "The most urgent problem today is how to limit and discourage the overfertility of the mentally and physically defective." The author uses this to draw a direct line, basically arguing that her secular humanist belief in scientific progress was inextricably linked to limiting the reproduction of those that she personally deemed unfit. Which brings us to part three, the Puerto Rico trials, ideology in practice. The text argues that these eugenics ideologies weren't just abstract theories. They were actually put into physical practice during the 1950s Puerto Rico contraceptive trials. Funded by major pharmaceutical interests like G.D. Searle and Co. to test the first birth control pill, these trials predominantly recruited poor, uneducated, rural women. And this happened in an environment already primed by Law 116, which legalized sterilization. According to the source, the trials heavily featured coercive practices. Vulnerable women were often completely left in the dark about the permanent nature of certain procedures or the really significant risks of the experimental drugs they were being given. All right, part four, the statistical shipwreck, tangible wreckage. To really illustrate the tangible fallout of these ideas, the text drops a staggering metric on us. Approximately 73 million induced abortions worldwide every single year, based on data from 2015 to 2019. The argument being made here is that a practice once marketed to society as something that should be safe, legal, and rare has actually morphed into a baseline of unprecedented global scale. And when you zoom out over the past century, that number swells to an estimated 2 to 3 billion globally. I mean, think about that scale for a second. It is a nearly unfathomable figure. For the author, this massive statistic proves that Sanger's original vision, which was the complete detachment of sex from reproduction through unfettered access to contraceptives and abortion, has been absolutely undeniably realized. Now, when analyzing 2019 CDC data, the text argues a darker narrative emerges regarding racial disparities. So while white women have the highest raw percentage of abortions overall, the abortion rate per 1,000 women tells a vastly different story. The data shows white women at 6.6, Hispanic women at 11.7, and Black women at 23.8, which is a rate over 3 times higher than that of white women. The text points directly to these stark ethnic disparities to argue that the early eugenic goals embedded in Sanger's organizations have subtly, but very effectively, succeeded. Let's shift into our final section, Part 5, the demographic collapse, the final consequence. The text concludes by looking at the looming worldwide consequence of treating children as a hindrance rather than a blessing. Based on data from demographer Dr. Stephen J. Shaw, a massive 70% of global nations are currently failing to meet the 2.1 birth rate needed just to sustain their populations. So, why does this matter to us right now? Well, the text argues that by widely adopting the pill and abortion, we haven't just reshaped individual lifestyles, we've essentially set the stage for an unprecedented global demographic and economic collapse as our populations continue to age and shrink. Echoing the words of Dr. Jordan B. Peterson, the text actually labels the advent of birth control and abortion as a social atom bomb. The overarching thesis here is that in this relentless pursuit of absolute hedonistic autonomy, society has traded away the inherent value of human life. By doing so, the author argues, we've fractured male and female relational dynamics and tragically reframed children from a profound blessing into just a burden or an obstacle to career success. And that leaves us with a truly provocative final question. Looking at the data, the shifting demographics, and the completely changing nature of our relationships, are we truly happier having the freedom to indulge every inhibition? Or have we lost something sacred in this demand for ultimate autonomy? It is a really heavy question, but one that challenges us to deeply reflect on the true societal cost of these historical and philosophical shifts. Thanks so much for joining us for this explainer, and as always, keep questioning the ideas that shape our world.